Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. As we tiptoe into 2026, lots of thoughts about how everything will be different in 2026. The Economist, for example, is running a piece about the contours of 21st century geopolitics will become clearer in 2026. We're in a post-Pax Americana world. But on this show, we tend to focus on that from a Washington, D.C. or a Berlin or a Beijing perspective. There are other perspectives as well. Soli Ozel, my old friend, who's based in Istanbul, brings a very different way of thinking, not just about the past and present, but the future. He's joining us now. Soli, what does the world look like from Istanbul? How does it look differently from Istanbul than it does from Washington, D.C. or London or Paris or Berlin?
I really don't know how it might look from London or Paris, both countries past imperial powers, very accustomed to having their way, having run the world for a very long time. And they are both in deep crisis. France cannot pass a budget. The UK is reportedly in dire straits. The Labour government, which came with a great majority, doesn't seem to be floating well, and all of that. So when you look at things from Istanbul, which is really in the middle of or in between two very, very serious troubled regions, the Black Sea, and beyond that, of course, Ukraine and Russia, and to the south, Syria, Iraq, Israel, the Fertile Crescent. Here, the sentiment is, and this is a sentiment that I think the government also wishes to present, is that as the unipolar world is over, we may be moving, or we are already in a multipolar world where mid-sized powers will have more room for maneuver. And given Turkey's geopolitical and even geoeconomic location, there are lots of opportunities for Turkey. This is how I think the public also views the developments, along with the fact that, of course, like the rest of the world, I suppose, there is some incomprehension about what the United States is doing, apprehension about what it might be doing, whether or not you can rely on its word, and all of that. I must say that prior to the elections, I think starting with the Turkish government and also many Turks who are interested in such matters, they actually vied for Trump. They wanted Trump to win. And from the government's perspective, this may still be a good bet, but I guess a lot of other people have second thoughts about
even you acknowledge, I know you're not a big Trump fan, but even you acknowledge that Trump is, you wrote a piece for the Montaigne Institute, where you had a conversation. Trump is a disruptor in an era that requires disruption. So I think whether you're on the left or the right, most people kind of acknowledge that. They're just not sure whether his form of disruption is the right one. Soli, coming back to this issue of looking at the world from Istanbul, from the perch of Istanbul rather than Washington, D.C. As you know, you've got lots of friends in the U.S. You and I went to grad school together. You've studied here. You've traveled and visited many times. There's a kind of hysteria about what people are calling this post-Pax Americana age. Does the antiquity of Istanbul, its remarkable history, I don't know if it's the most continuous history, it has the most continuous history of any city in the world, but certainly amongst the most, many different names and civilizations. Does that bring a little bit less hysteria, saying, well, America had their moment after the Second World War. Now it's come to an end. Now there's an opportunity for something or someone else.
Oh yeah, I mean that is obviously a way of look. I mean, Istanbul has been the seat of power for, if you consider East Roman Empire, or it was a paired capital of Roman Empire, and then of course it was the capital of Eastern Roman Empire, and then of course it was the capital of the Ottoman Empire until the Ottoman Empire basically dissolved in 1922. So there is of course a sense of historical knowledge or historical memory that glories come and go. And one of my recent theses, Andrew, is that it's very difficult to lose an empire. You can never really digest it. I mean, look at Russia. You want to recreate the empire. Even France and Britain did not really particularly digest it well, that they lost their empires. They still have imperial pretensions. And that the United States may not be any longer the United States that it was at the very end of the Cold War, in the unipolar moment and all of that. In that sense, I think many Turkish observers, especially in the power, believe that the United States certainly is in relative decline, and maybe it's the West, which is finally, after maybe 300 or 350 years of supremacy over the rest of the world, is basically ceding ground, and the sun is rising once more from the east. And Turkey, because of its location, its history, and all of that, believes that in the new configuration in the world, it will have a prized place as well. Now, and the thing is, of course, all of those things need to be managed. My view is, and this will be my last point in this thing, rather than looking who's doing better, who's doing worse, I think we need to look at which country or which group of countries can manage their vulnerabilities better, because all of them have vulnerabilities. I mean, I just finished reading a piece by Elizabeth Economy in Foreign Affairs, how the Chinese are working in space, in Arctic, in oceans and stuff. And they have been really thinking through all of those things. And then they're ahead in green technologies. They're probably going to catch up with high technologies, and definitely artificial intelligence and stuff. But they have vulnerabilities. The US has vulnerabilities, and I think it is not really managing them well, as far as I can see nowadays. Europe doesn't even know how to handle the vulnerabilities. I'm not even sure that they identify their own. But all of the countries, whether it be Brazil, South Africa, or Saudi Arabia, every country that is a contender for some place in the sun in the new world power configuration does have vulnerabilities, and whether or not they'll be able to manage those well is going to be a determining factor what kind of place they will have in the new order, when
it's
the order
interesting.
returns.
You know that it's hard to lose an empire, certainly to regain it. You talk about the French and the British, although there's that phrase, I don't know who said it, certainly wasn't Churchill, but it could have been Churchill, that Britain acquired its empire in a fit of forgetfulness and lost it in the same way. When we talk about the decline of quote unquote American empire, was the empire ideological, Soli? The idea of America making the world a better place? Maybe sometimes true, and in other cases, certainly not true. So in a sense, the American crisis is more ideological than territorial.
Well, that the United States also reflects an idea. I mean, its self-perception is, of course, is the city on the hill. It's the new Israel. It has a providential duty, and all of those make the American self-conception, as far as I can understand it, a very ideological one. And of course, nowadays, what we're seeing is two different versions of what that ideal notion of the United States ought to be. And obviously, the current administration does not particularly favor the liberal understanding of the liberal creed that defines the United States. It's a much more homogeny seeking more Christian, more white, more conservative understanding of America, which was, of course, always a presence in the way the country has developed. Henry Kissinger used to ask whether or not Iran was a cause or a nation. And I think it could be legitimately asked of him to say whether or not the United States is a cause or a nation as well. And I think the United States is as much a cause as a nation, and it is not trying to redefine itself as a cause. And then we'll see how it will do it as a nation and how it will have a place in the new world.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And of course, that's why Trump's obsession with the US, the territory of the United States of America, upsets so many people, because if you are indeed a cause, then it doesn't really matter, does it, Soli?
Sorry, I didn't get you. I was caught.
If your identity is as a cause, then geography doesn't matter. Of course, Trump is focusing on a new kind of geography, or maybe an old kind of geography, the geography of the US in terms of immigration, and then, of course, the geography of Latin America, of Venezuela, of Greenland, of Panama.
I think the US, from its very founding, I would think, it has been very conscious of geography, partially because it felt very insecure, and partially the logic of its being necessitated expansion. And of course, Trump tries to redefine the United States, not just as ideologically, but also territorially. And that is more the issue of Greenland, which of course rather angered the Danes when everybody begins to say that Greenland ought to belong to the United States, and now there is a special volunteer representative to deal with that particular issue. And then, as the new national security strategy document suggests, they claim to have a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which basically says, okay, Latin America is our turf and you should not really do anything here. By the way, of course, at that time, the United States could not really live up to the kind of power that protecting or keeping the Latin America for itself. It didn't really have that. In a way, it depended on the British Navy, but that's the conception, or that's the way they look at Latin America, as their own turf. And after a long period of neglect of Latin America, whether you like the way they approach it or not, the Trump administration had really turned towards Latin America and wishes to make sure that other powers that are not American, Latin America, South or North American powers, that they should not have much influence in Latin America. And that, of course, means China and Russia in particular.
Yeah, Trump talks about America first, but it's America first in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in North America. It's not America first in Taiwan or the Ukraine. Is what's happening?
No, but wait. I mean, in Taiwan, after NSS in particular said, "Oh, they don't say anything bad about China. They don't really consider China a threat." What does that say to us about Taiwan? The next day, or a few days after the document was published, here we see the sale of $11 billion worth of weapons to Taiwan, which will obviously fortify their defenses. So it hasn't been given up, kind of symbolically, at least.
Well, let me ask you this question. This is, I certainly don't know the answer to this. I hope I don't know the answer to any question, otherwise I shouldn't be asking it. But is any of this new, Soli? So America retreats into its own backyard. It reinvents the Monroe Doctrine, the so-called Donroe Doctrine. It focuses on new resources in Greenland. It begins to reinvent its relationship with Canada. Of course, it rethinks all the stuff about Europe. Is any of this new?
No, it isn't. I mean, Charles Kopchan from Georgetown University.
And I got an upcoming interview with him, actually. And actually, it will probably come out next week, just before this one.
Okay, and Charlie wrote a book called Isolationism. It's a thick book too. And by and large, what he's arguing is that the default option for American foreign policy, certainly in the 19th century and in a very strong way after in the interwar period between the end of the first and beginning of the Second World Wars, was isolationism. And he thought that liberal internationalism has really run its course. The American public was no longer as supportive of the liberal internationalist inclinations of American foreign policy that were put in place after the Second World War, when the United States assumed the position of the hegemon and, if you want, the defender of the liberal capitalist democratic world against the Soviet Union, its system, and its empire. And he thought that isolationism was not the irrational option for the United States any longer, but neither was the kind of liberal internationalism. And he wanted to have, if you will, an adjusted version of liberal internationalism, which would also take into consideration the concerns of the American people that did not want to sustain an imperial project for much longer for a whole variety of reasons. So in that sense, it's not really new, or at least elements of it are not new. And so the question really is, how is the Trump administration isolationist? It doesn't really look that way, truly. But it is certainly much less interested in abroad. It's interested in Latin America, but not in other places. That's what they say. On the other hand, they want to change the way the European Union is organized. They want to change the principles upon which the European Union was built, and they want to work bilaterally with European Union members, especially parties there with which have hard right policies and hard right that they represent hard right movements, which will then change the nature of what we consider to be the West in the post-World War II period. So it is not isolationist, it is very unilateralist, obviously, and it wishes to use its immense power in bilateral relations. And it truly wants to change the definition of the West, because the West stood for liberal capitalist democracy, and liberalism or democracy don't seem to count all that much in the definition of the West that the Trump administration or many of its players have in mind.
I wonder, one thing that might be new is the nature of immigration in the 21st century, a lot of it coming through Turkey as a consequence of the Syrian civil war, of the endless unrest in Afghanistan, in Africa, of course, or that tends to come from North Africa into Europe. That's what seems to tie Western Europe and the United States together. That's what explains the rise of populist nationalism. Is this new, Soli? I mean, again, from your wise perch in Istanbul, always been a place that people pass through on the boundary of Asia and Europe on the Bosphorus. Is this different historically, or have we always been paranoid about new people of religions or colors or ideologies coming into our country?
Look, the United States is a country of immigrants. And then, of course, each wave of immigrants was kind of discriminated against. For a period of time, and then they integrated, and it was all fine. They then closed their doors in 1922, I believe, when they passed the immigration law. And it really hasn't been totally liberalized until the Immigration Act of 1964, when the United States also opened its doors to non-whites much more liberally. And I think, and Europe, by the way, yes, when we think of Europe, we think of white Christian, this, that, and the other. But Europe also was a place where many people actually came and lived, and then they were dispersed, and others came, and all that. My view in all of that is this: the period after the Second World War, particularly starting with the 1960s, were a period in developed capitalist democratic countries where the definition of the nation and the definition of citizenship were actually enlarged. Okay, it was more welcoming, and whether it may not have succeeded in Europe to integrate, especially those immigrants who came to work that were of a different ethnic group or a different religion, but it was open and it was welcoming. The crisis of capitalism that you've already talked with a lot of your guests before, and the harm that the globalization had inflicted on local people suddenly made the immigrant, if you will, the embodiment of what was wrong in their lives or what caused what was wrong in their lives, and that therefore the anti-globalization, anti-cosmopolitan reaction, which then translated itself most concretely on an anti-immigrant stance. And what I see today is, of course, that this definition of the nation is shrinking again. The definition of citizenship is also shrinking. We will be with that type of attitude for a while. But if these things come in cycles, there must come a time, especially given the fact that demographically developed countries that are aging will be needing people that to come and work and all of that. That might change as well. It just will be very difficult, I think, because of employment problems, resources problems, and all of that. Yeah.
You talk about
I mean,
cycles.
in a way, you have invited Gary Gerstle, and I when I was just talking, I remembered some of the things that he wrote,
Yeah,
and
Gersa was
what
on the show a few days ago
yeah,
on the post-neoliberal world, the world
yeah,
of national capitalism.
and the way he ends the end of neoliberal era or the neoliberal order book is, okay, he says the neoliberal order is over, but we don't yet know exactly what kind of order will replace it, because the creation or the building of a nation, of an order, its consolidation really takes time. So in a way, maybe the turbulence we're going through today also is reflective of the fact that we don't have a blueprint. So it's like a trial and error kind of thing. And then there are cross currents, there are currents that go against one another. There is reaction or resistance to, let's say, what the Trump administration is doing or what the right wingers, for instance, in Holland tried to do, and then they haven't succeeded. So there will be a lot of back and forth, and then we will find a new equilibrium point. I just cannot say now how long that will take
Yeah,
and how
we're all
brutal the
wondering what
process may
will.
be.
You
Yeah,
mentioned Gary Gerstle. We also did a show a few days ago with Branko Milanovic, the Serbian
yeah,
American economist, and what comes after neoliberalism. Soli, our mutual friend Ece Temelkuran wrote a wonderful book a few years ago called How to Lose a Country, which
yeah.
warned the West that they were going the same way as Turkey's Erdogan authoritarian regime. Can we learn something in terms of trying to figure out the future from Turkey, in spite of its antiquity, or certainly the antiquity of civilizations in Turkey? Turkey always seems first in this. What can we learn from the Turkish experience about the next step in this cycle?
Look, Ece Temel Kur'an's book was really a very good book. In fact, I did use it in class myself, and maybe I don't know if it really received the kind of attention and appreciation that I personally thought it deserved. And a lot of people in the developed world did not really take it seriously, thinking that this can only happen, let's say, in a place like Turkey or in Latin America, that it could not happen in those mature democracies. And of course, it is happening. And then, if there is one lesson that I think Turkey might provide, and it's been a pathbreaker in terms of establishing or receding from democratic orders. If there is one lesson, it's that you should never give up on politics. The moment you give up on politics and you basically succumb to whatever reality it is that you're facing, then the game is really lost. So long as you fight, so long as you resist, so long as that you keep, if you want to, you keep hope alive and all of that, and engage in politics, there is always room for change. So the opposition and what it does is as important as what the powers holders do. And the thing is, you do need a political channel. Look at Serbia, for instance. I don't know, I don't remember if you talked to Milanovic about that. I was in Belgrade a month ago. And of course, the students there have been demonstrating for about 15 months, but they don't have a political channel where that energy can be actually poured to. And it's incredible that they still have the energy to go out in the streets to protest and all of that. But you need to have a political platform. You need to have a political agency in order to be able to get to changing things.
You wrote back in April of this year, a piece for Montaigne on Turkey called "A Crisis of Legitimacy and a Massive Social Mobilization in a Regional Power." In fact, I think you came on this show to talk more about this.
Yeah.
There always seems to be a crisis of legitimacy in Turkey, Soli. I mean, how many more times? I'm not saying you personally can write this article, but how many more times can we talk about a crisis of legitimacy and nothing change?
No, but I really don't think we have had the same government or the same party in power for the last 23 years. I don't believe from the beginning there was a legitimacy crisis at all. That's a much newer phenomenon in my judgment.
So will this crisis then continue, metastasize in 2026?
Well, we're going to see how things really move on in 2026. It will also depend, and I really wish us to engage in the developments of the world as well. I mean, Turkey is always very susceptible to the developments in the world, and as I said, it is really in between. It's sandwiched between two areas of belligerency: the Black Sea, Ukraine, Russia, and of course Syria, Iraq, and we still don't know. I mean, if you want, one of the things that really scare me, and I think I'm not wrong in being scared, is that we might have a second round of an attack against Iran. Okay, and what kind of repercussions that will have in the region is something that I need to ponder. And whether
from
or not
Israel or from the United States,
I would expect that from Israel. I mean, you do have people in authority to actually talk about these things, and whether or not the United States will either allow this or will join this, will remain neutral. I really have no idea. But the thing is, all the troubled spots of the world, that the troubles have not been resolved, despite the declarations that peace has been signed between in eight different crisis points, and Turkey actually, as I said, is sandwiched between at least two of the most important ones. And if you count Iran as a separate case, then there are three of those cases.
Steve Walt, another distinguished American political scientist, geopolitical thinker, wrote a really interesting piece in Foreign Policy about Trump's fake peace deals are dangerous. Is this what's new, Soli, that previous American presidents haven't invented peace deals that certainly can't last? For example, he's talking about this attempt to turn Gaza into a high-tech metropolis, costing many hundreds of billions of dollars. It's hard to know where.
108 billion, I think. No.
Yeah, or over 100 billion, and who knows what's going to happen with Hamas. I do want to talk about Israel in a few minutes, but on Gaza. But do you think that this is what's new, these fake peace deals, and that's what makes Trump different from other kinds of politicians in the 21st century? Is that he lies? His political default is to invent the truth, or to misrepresent the truth.
I mean, I read that piece and I was as impressed as you are. I'm usually very impressed by what Stephen Walt does write. The thing about Trump is that there is always this dimension of spectacle, isn't there, in everything he does?
Performative, exactly.
Performative, exactly. And in some sense, this is what all these, and we know he wants the Nobel Peace Prize. So you put the spectacle on and you expect that the spectacle by itself will suffice. And he does not, or his administration does not seem to have the discipline on the one hand to follow through things. And secondly, the fact that he relies on non-professionals in order to actually tackle extraordinarily complicated matters such as the Israel-Palestinian conflict or Russia-Ukraine conflict or India-Pakistan. I mean, these things have been around for quite a long time, quite frankly. And then you give hope, and you create that spectacle, and then suddenly things may actually begin to crumble, as many people. And by the way, remember, the Russia-Ukraine war was supposed to be taken care of in 24 hours, and obviously it's been many 24 hours, and there is no end in sight. It continues to be very bloody as well. And President Trump seems to be very sensitive about the loss of lives. He always cites the numbers, the most recent numbers of casualties. And also in Gaza, Israel, yes, there is a push to have the second stage of the deal that was signed, but the conditions don't seem to be there. The sides don't seem to be really attuned to do all of that thing. So persistence is not really a forte. And again, amateurs can only do so much. And at some point, you need the professionals. And unfortunately, the professionals are not really trusted to carry on with those tasks, except perhaps in the defense.
And of course, there's the other element of patrimonialism. Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, has got involved in this ceasefire. He has his own self-interest, real estate investment, self-interest from the Gulf and from real estate. So there's also a sort of an element of patrimonialism. Our friends Jeff Kopstein and Steve Hansen just wrote a book about the reappearance of patrimonialism. So it's this kind of weird mix of patrimonialism and reality television and fantasy social media. That's what defines Trumpism.
It's very 21st century, though, isn't it, Andrew?
Why?
Well, the combination that you mentioned, social media, business interests, really, a lot of patronage, and also basically a superficiality in approaching things that in prior times you didn't expect power holders, especially the power holders of a major power like the United States, would be engaged in.
It's rather, Soli, you and I were at grad school together. We did all sorts of seminars on world history and Marx and capitalism. It's rather disappointing, isn't it, that the new thing is so old?
Is it really? I mean, yeah. No, you know what?
I mean, we were promised so much. We were promised post-capitalism. We were promised this and that. And what we have now is this rather dispiriting mix of reality television, fantasy, real estate self-interest, and a return to the great power territorial ambitions of the 19th century.
Yep, we see that on the Russia-Ukraine thing. We see that in the desire to incorporate Greenland into American sovereignty, if you will. And there are other countries that have. I mean, Israel is expansionist, and I suppose that's what the Thailand-Cambodia war was all about. China and India have skirmishes over little pieces of land and all of that. You're right, but that I think is mainly because we are in a transitional period, and that is everybody wishes to grab as much as they can before all the chips fall into place. You know what I find striking? The World Bank and the IMF on the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Agreement. Bretton Woods agreements created both institutions, and these are, if you will, the custodians of international capitalism. And they had this report on the 80th anniversary, and the main part of the report begins with a quotation from an Italian Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, about the old is dead and the new is yet to born, and then this is the time of monsters and stuff. And I think, I mean, I guess if you're a political scientist or a social scientist, you need to really quote Gramsci if you're going to give a talk,
Everyone's
or you're going
quoting
to
that.
write some. I mean, whether you're a rightist or a leftist, it doesn't really matter. But it's ironic that an Italian Marxist from the 1930s is the person that gives us the most appropriate quote. And I look at it in that way, and I'm not really as maybe pessimistic as you are, or as
I'm not necessarily pessimistic, just
no,
disappointed intellectually.
no, but the thing is, look, disappointment is part of life, and you would hope that you learn from your disappointments, and and I go back to what I said about Ece's book and what needs to be done, and that's politics stinks. Everybody's disgusted by it. It has become very corrupt. You see that, business interests and political interests are so intermeshed and all of that. But the thing is, it really is the only recourse as well. And and maybe unlike you, I see on the one hand all those forces that seem to be indomitable, and then you have increasing repression almost everywhere. But I also see a lot of resistance. I see a lot of resistance, and I see a lot of resistance in particular on the part of women who, in a very conservative age, has much more to lose than the other gender, I must say.
Yeah, and Ece's last book on love is very much about that. I'm not suggesting that I'm disappointed about that. Let's end, Soli, with a little bit more concreteness. We've talked.
Okay.
You described US as the new Israel. Of course, it was the new Israel. Now there's the new Israel, post 1948 Israel. You wrote back in January of last year that the Israel-Hamas ceasefire is a deal that cannot last. I can't remember whether that ceasefire lasted. Maybe there's been new ones. Can we expect anything new? I know that the Turkish state is becoming more involved. They've been hosting Hamas officials. You've been developing a relationship with Egypt as Washington backs out a little bit. Can we expect anything different on the Israel-Gaza front in 2026, or is it just going to be more of the same? Failed ceasefires, violence?
I wish I could say that we could. I really doubt it. I was just going to look at the. I mean, I just finished reading Hussein Aga and Robert Malley's book. Yesterday is tomorrow, or tomorrow is yesterday. It's brilliant because it's also by two insiders, and the way this thing is framed, I don't really see a way out. Look, after 2 years of an extraordinarily bloody war. Massacres, genocide, maybe. And at the end of the day, Hamas is there, armed, has eliminated all its rivals. The Israelis occupy 53% of the Gaza Strip, and they say they're not necessarily going to leave it. That's what their chief of staff has said. And the current configuration in Israeli politics, the current government, is unlikely to move voluntarily on the second stage, although the United States is pushing them. And Israel in 2026 will be on an electoral cycle. That doesn't strike me as a very propitious moment to achieve what the peace plan actually sought. So I have to say that I'm not that optimistic about how that thing may unfold. And by the opinion of many experts of the region of this particular conflict, whether they be of the right or the left, the expectation is that there will be skirmishes, there will be violence, but not at the scale of what we've seen after October 7. And then we'll have to wait till the elections are over in Israel, and then there's going to be elections in Palestine as well, and maybe that will be a new beginning, and that's all we can hope for.
You don't sound very optimistic. You're also fearful of what might happen in Iran. What about to your north, the Ukrainian crisis? You noted earlier you didn't expect much of a peace there. As we speak, there seems to be some concessions on the part of the Ukrainians that they're willing to trade some degree of territory for peace. Is there any chance of peace in Ukraine in 2026, Soli?
One wishes, look, again, it's a full-time job to actually get all the ins and outs of that conflict. I mean, just yesterday, I've read 3 pieces talking about the Russian economy. One was certain that by mid-2026, the Russian economy would really be suffering and it would start biting Putin or his regime. And the other 2 basically suggested that no, the Russians can actually willy-nilly can manage it. And the thing is, the Ukrainians yesterday, I believe, retreated from an important post, strategic post, and they do have serious manpower problems because a lot of people are defecting. They don't want to join the military, and the demographic difference between the 2 countries actually shows. On the other hand, neither side, in my judgment, to the best of my assessment, they're not ready to sign a peace deal. The Europeans now have given the Ukrainians permission to strike Russia inside the country and stuff. We'll see how it will all go. Again, it's who's going to prove to be more resilient. The Russians may have the upper hand because they have more manpower, but the Ukrainians are not going to give the Russians everything they want. And if the Russian maximalism continues, I suppose we will see a lot more bloodletting this year as well.
It doesn't seem as though it's going to be a very happy new year, Soli. We'll talk again during 2026. But when we meet again in December or late December, early January 2026, 2027, what's the best case realistically? You've always been a realist. We can't dream here. But what can we realistically hope for? In the world itself, you're not particularly cheerful, nor am I. Where's the cheer going to come in 2026? The good cheer.
Several things. There may be more balance in American politics, and that may actually pull things together a bit more. Maybe a new consensus will be built, which may then lead perhaps to a more open relation between China and the United States. But my real big hope, and it may be hope against hope, is for Europe to actually pull itself together. Because if Europe can actually pull itself together, and on the one hand remains a major source of democratic politics in the world, and if it can become a strategic actor and therefore be the balancer between the United States and China as well, that'll bring some degree of, I think, equilibrium to world politics as well. Currently, the European Union is being attacked by China economically, by Russia geopolitically, and by the United States both economically and geopolitically in terms of America's withdrawal from its responsibilities in protecting Europe, which of course the Europeans are very guilty themselves for not for constantly relying on the United States security umbrella. So my big hope for 2026 will be for the European Union to actually pull its act together. It may be a big if. I now also read many articles about how the European Union may not see, I don't know, 4 years from now, may not be together 4 years from now, 6 years from now, whatever. I hope that doesn't happen because we do need the balancing potential and capacity of the European Union, which should also try to develop its relations with the so-called either global south or the middle powers in different continents, because that's the only way we can basically avoid clashes between the major powers, especially if the intention that people read into the national security strategy document is that the Trump administration prefers a world divided in zones of influence. That'll be very bad, in my judgment, for the world. And so Europe can actually play that balancing role, and it will have to cooperate with major middle powers in different continents. That's a
Wisdom,
way
as
out.
always, from Istanbul,
Yeah.
from my old friend Soli Ozel. Soli, happy, healthy New Year, and we will talk certainly before this time next year.
Okay.
So
To
thank
you
you
and
so much.
your listeners as well. Thank you, Andrew. Have a happy New Year.